Carlos Murillo has enjoyed recently an enormous success with his play Dark Play, or Stories for Boys. He also is the author of Unfinished American Highwayscape No. 9, or The Broken Tractor Graveyard, A Human Interest Story, or The Gory Details and All, Offsprings of the Cold War, Patron Saint of the Nameless Dead, and many, many others. He's been produced throughout the United States in small theaters and large theaters, regional theaters, and the like. Would you please welcome to the Kennedy Center and the Dramatists Guild, Carlos Murillo. So, Carlos, we're going to start simple, a very easy question to begin with, which is, what brought you to writing, and how did you find your way there? I understand you're also a director. Mm-hmm. So did you start off as a director, move to writing, or did you start off as a writer, moved into directing, or were you an actor first, or?
Well, I mean, since I was a small child, I always wrote stuff, and when I was 6, I was writing novels and stuff like that. But in terms of, seriously writing, and when I was about 17 or 18, I was really interested in acting, and I did this summer program with the old Soho Repertory Theatre. They used to do the summer program up in Saratoga Springs, and they invited high school students from around New York State to participate. And it was an acting program, but they also had playwriting classes, and I was kind of torn between the two. And it was the first time where, when I was writing, I felt like I was channeling voices rather than sort of controlling what was happening on paper, and a play came out of that, and I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. That's sort of unexpected, and at that point my focus shifted away from acting, and then primarily focusing on writing.
Right, and so did the directing just grew out of that, or?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, it was sort of a challenge that was posed to me when I was, because I ended up going to Syracuse University to study acting, and I only ended up staying for a year. And one of the teachers there, who I sought out as a mentor, she asked me one day, well, what do you want to do? And I'm like, well, I'm really interested in acting. I'm really interested in writing. I'd like to direct. And she said, you can't do all of those things. And I was like, what do you mean you can't do all those things? And she said, you've got to really focus on one thing and put all your energy into that. And so in a lot of ways, my life has been about trying to prove that wrong. So I see them as kind of continuums of the same thing. And so I've directed my own work, and I direct other people's works as well. It's less of a focus. Most people know me as a playwright, and often people will say, "Oh, you direct as well? I didn't know that." But it's something that is growing in importance in my work right now.
Was there a seminal moment where you said, "I'm a writer. That's what I am"?
I think it was. I think it was a couple. There were a couple of incidents. There's sort of moments in your life where either you get good encouragement from the right person, or something happens in your process that you feel like, oh, I didn't know I had that in me, or I didn't know that was in my imagination. And I think of two. There's I spent a quarter at the O'Neill at the National Theatre Institute, and I took one of the playwriting classes there. And again, I had this experience of the characters speaking through me rather than me kind of trying to control and put voices in my characters, and I remember that being a really intense experience of waking up in the middle of the night and having to kind of vomit out whatever was happening up here, or whatever the characters were doing. And so that was a really important experience. And then later on, I was doing an internship at New York Theatre Workshop, and at the time Robert Woodruff was on a Pew residency there working, and he asked me to be his assistant, and I worked with him for a year, kind of finding obscure plays and hanging out in his apartment and talking about stuff. I mean, it was just sort of, I was like a human sounding board for a lot of his wacky ideas, and so I'd come to him every week with a stack of plays that he'd asked to see and that kind of thing. And then one day I kind of slipped one of my own plays in there that I was working on, and just didn't say anything, just sort of gave him the stack and said, "See you later. I'm curious if he'll even read it," that kind of thing. And he called me the next day, and he said, "I read your play." And I was like, "Yeah." And he's like, "It's really cool. We should really talk about it." And he dealt with it in a very serious way that I think, for me, gave me a huge boost in confidence, and really kind of solidified for me what was that I was, that it was a path to follow.
And was that before you'd ever seen any of your work in production, or had you seen some of your work in production?
That was before. Well, I had seen at the O'Neill, we had done like a little staged reading of the play that I wrote there. But that's not something I'd show anyone at this point in my life. But that, in terms of, it was the first kind of real play that I had written, and I had not seen a reading or a workshop of it. And then actually Woodruff directed a reading of it the following year, and that was another kind of, push forward. And so I think those two things, the experience of kind of feeling like I wasn't writing the play was a huge thing, and then also having Woodruff being one of them, but several other people along the way who were very helpful in terms of saying, "This is good. Keep doing this." And,
right.
And I think you talk to any writer, and I think they have those kind of marks along the way that really push them forward.
Sure. Dale Lander-Smith was here the other day.
Uh-huh.
And she said quite early on, I'd asked her a question. Actually, I'd read a quote, and I just was asking her to talk a little bit more about it. And the quote was essentially this. She says in this quote, "I do not like to be pigeonholed. I do not like to be labeled as a female African-American playwright." Mm-hmm. And then she went on to explain that the reason that she doesn't want, well, you know what? I won't tell you why she said that. Here's my question to you: you are a Latino playwright, and how do you sit with that? Is that an okay category for you, or label, or place to put your work? Is it not? Does it matter? Does it not?
I have a really ambivalent relationship with that label. I mean, obviously, I'm a Latino playwright. My father's Colombian, my mother's Puerto Rican. I grew up in a home that Spanish and English were spoken, and I lived in South America. But I also grew up. My father was an immigrant, and he was very much about assimilation, and we lived in the suburbs in New York. So a lot of my influences were from white suburban America, and how those two backgrounds kind of fused together, I think, finds its way into my work in a more oblique way. I think that I think that the idea of there being a kind of monolithic Latino identity is a myth. I mean, we're talking dozens of countries, dozens of histories, people who tell jokes about each other that aren't very nice, people who fought wars against each other, and I think that there's a kind of there's an outward perception that it is this kind of monolithic thing. And sure, there are things that do connect us. I remember being in Mexico, and what year was it? It was during the World Cup sometime in the 90s, and just seeing how the Mexicans were following Mexico up until they got eliminated, and then they started following any Spanish-speaking country, as it went on. So there are things like that. But in terms of my own work, there are a couple of early plays that dealt specifically with my family history, but I tend to write what's interesting to me at the time that I'm writing it, and having grown up sort of with one foot in a very kind of mainstream American household, and at the same time that same household being different and outsider, I think has influenced my work in terms of if there is a common thread, and I don't know if I'm prepared to really talk about that, but if there is a common thread, there's a sense of outsider looking in, or someone who's kind of who has a sort of fluidity of identity where they can become a lot of different things. And but I don't think, if I were to send my script blindly to someone, would they recognize that this was a person of Latino descent? Probably not. But so yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, I'm curious if you feel any kind of pressure from the Latino community to be in a sense, to be a spokesperson for the community through your art, and do you ever feel that, or?
I think, well, that's a tough one. I don't feel pressure per se, but I do. I've felt a wide range of responses from some writers and people in the theater community who are like, "That's very cool. It's the next generation of Latino writing. That it's kind of getting beyond autobiography, getting beyond kind of the traditional forms that we expect." from Latino playwrights, and others who sort of question, like, well, why aren't you writing about, you know, family history? Why aren't you writing about the community? And again, I think, you know, that means so many different things to a lot of different people. So, you know, and then on the backside of that is that a lot of the sense that I get from a lot of literary managers and people who run theaters is that question, well, is this a Latino play? Is it the Latino playwright? Is it, you know, and what does that actually mean? And I think a lot of writers who are coming up now are really grappling with that question and sort of saying, okay, well, what is there a kind of pocket that a Latino play needs to live in to be considered a Latino play, or is the identity of the writer present in no matter what the content is?
What do you think? This is a question that I've actually asked practically everybody who has sat in your chair. What do you think the responsibility of the playwright is in this contemporary culture? Or is there a response? There may not be. I certainly don't want to bait the question, but do you feel you have one? And if you do, what is it?
If I see a responsibility, I feel like my responsibility as a writer is to figure out a way, I don't want to speak for other playwrights, but to figure out a way to advance the form. And how do we, and one of the things that I've been consciously grappling with in the last 4 or 5 plays has been, how do you tell stories on stage that truly reflect not only the times we live in, but the way we receive stories in the contemporary era, which I think is changing in huge ways with the growth of the internet, with the a kind of disinterest in traditional narrative form. You think of reality television, you think of you know, stuff on YouTube, and I think especially young people have a different way of receiving narrative and experiencing narrative, and my responsibility, I feel, on some level, is to try to write plays that both in form and content speak to that change, because I think, you know, storytelling is essential, and but at the same time, there's a part of me that feels like if there's an inessential form of storytelling, theater is probably at the top of the list. And how do you? And if you're trying to find a compelling reason to do it, you know, there's a lot of talk about we need to bring younger audiences in, and it becomes for me a little bit of a sort of weird evangelism that somehow theater is good for you, or theater's, you know, elevating in some way that other art forms or other experiences aren't. And so the question I grapple with is, how do you make something that's very kind of vivid and alive and very present, that can address what I think of as what I call the kind of mythology of pain, that we experience painful things in life, and what stories do we create around those painful events to navigate them, or to, especially inexplicable things, you know, murders you see on television, or people disappearing, or you know, the recent play that's about an internet crime, and how do you, and the will that people have to build stories around things that are painful, and I think plays can do that in a way that that a lot of other forms can't.
Mm-hmm. I've known your writing for several years, and the first thing, I met you on paper. We just actually recently met in person a couple hours ago. But one of the things that struck me, aside from these like incredibly vivid characters and this kind of dark rage and passion and all the things that we love about the theater, this is going to sound in a way silly, but there is an architecture about your page that I don't see in pretty much anybody else's work. Literally meaning how that work is laid out on the stage. So I'm curious where that came from in your development, and what's the response to it?
Well, it came from, again, it goes back to that sort of weird channeling thing about how I hear stuff, and how I hear a character speak, how I hear a voice, and you're always hearing the thought process if you're listening really carefully. And how do you replicate the thought process? And the second thing is also making something as foolproof as possible. because you're sending your scripts out, and oftentimes you don't have control over what's actually happening. And if you're really careful and almost manipulative about how you lay it out, there's only really one way of saying these words. And if all the other elements fail in production, if the language and the words are spoken the way they're supposed to, the play will survive intact somehow. So it's and partly it's a survival mechanism, but really it's just the way I hear things and the way I hear a particular character talk, where they break a line, like I just did, where I'm thinking about something and I'm kind of put myself on pause, and then the next thought comes, and how do you replicate that on the page?
So this was your own innovation then. Was it something that you studied from somebody else, or something that you've...
I think it's a combination of things. You know, I think of playwrights who punctuate really well. Carol Churchill, as an example, Susan Lloyd Parks, you know, who really use and manipulate the way the language is on the page, definitely inspired me. And then it just became a very organic thing. And I find I've never done this, but I'm sure if I put, you know, all my plays side to side, you would see the layout change, you know, and become more and more kind of more blank space and, you know, fewer words on a page. And that's just evolved. Again, it's just how I hear things. And
I mean, not to belabor the point, but when we were publishing one of your pieces in an anthology that I edited, I remember having a discussion with the editor, and I said, does he need all that blank space on the page? And he wrote back and said, yes, indeed, he does. This is before, actually, I got to know you. Yeah. I know also that you are the father of 2 beautiful children.
Yes, thank you.
So I'm curious to know, is there a shift, or was there a shift between when you had your children and now that you're a father?
That's still something that I'm figuring out. I mean, certainly time is a huge, I mean, I teach full-time and my wife teaches full-time, and we have the 2 kids, and so writing time is a little bit more of a precious commodity these days. So in a purely practical sense, that's a constant, you know, navigation. I think the work that you know, it's very interesting actually. There's a play that was done of mine, play of mine that was done last year in California called Unfinished American Highway Escape. And there was one character in the play who is driving around. It's all these people who are driving around the United States, and they're disconnected, but then these connections form. And this woman who's driving with a child that's screaming in the back of her car. And I wrote that image, you know, actually when my wife was pregnant with our daughter Ava. And I knew nothing about raising children or what the experience was like. And when we started rehearsals, the play was really, really, I felt like not in a state to go into rehearsal. But we were in rehearsal, so I'm like, okay, I'm here for 10 days, let's finish the play. And so I worked really hard on shaping the play. And I remember that particular storyline, I understood it in a way that I hadn't understood it. And you know, one of the questions was like, what is this woman doing? You know, who is she and why is she on the road with her child? What is she running from? And the answer became very, very simple, that, you know, her kid's colicky and, you know, she can't fall asleep, and you put her in the car and you drive around and hope for the best. So that was kind of, I was able to understand that character more deeply because of that. And I think, you know, with dark play, my daughter was 1.5 when I wrote the first draft of that. And you know, your level of fear increases exponentially when you have a child, let alone 2 children. You know, all the possible things that can go wrong that you don't think about when you don't have kids. And I think that play, which is about an adolescent who really kind of doesn't have guidance outside of his own will and his own kind of exploration of the world, makes a lot of really bad, unfortunate choices. And I think I was able to tap into his psychology in a slightly different way because of my own fears about what may happen to my children. So yeah, and definitely. And you know, I'm starting a new piece, and there are certain images that I don't know where they're going yet, but certain images and ideas that are definitely related to things that can go wrong, you know, with your children. And so yeah, but again, we'll see. You know, I think if you ask me that question 5 years down the line, I may have a very different answer. But
how old are your children?
I have a 3-year-old daughter and a 1.5. He'll be 2 in October.
So I asked this question the other day to Marsha Norman because I had been out somewhere and I was in an elementary school, and I think it was either the first grade or second grade, and someone introduced me as a playwright, and of course his bright blue eyes come up and say, "What's that?" So do your children or are they at that place where they can ask that? But more importantly, when they do, what will your answer be?
Huh. Well, they've come to rehearsals and they've seen, especially my oldest daughter. My son's still a bit too young, and my daughter's actually freaked out by theater. She'll you'll bring her into the space and then she'll, want to run, but then she'll become interested and obsessed with it. And if and when they ask the question, so she knows that mommy and daddy do this kind of work where we go into rooms and there's all kinds of pretend happening and all sorts of strange things, and that we have to travel because daddy's doing a play here, or et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of what the actual thing we do, or the thing that I do, I just think I'm a storyteller, and we tell stories in this particular way. And I tell her a lot of stories, and I've actually learned a lot about storytelling by virtue of repetition and, how you invent a story and then you elaborate and you embellish things because, oh, she's delighted by this particular thing, can I expand that and explore that? And it has really influenced my teaching, actually, because, I think, and how to teach rewriting is also related to telling children's stories, that this detail can be exploded or expanded, or you don't really need this detail, and how do you deal with a rewrite as a kind of children's story?
I've been teaching for, speaking of teaching, I've been teaching for a while at NYU, and I know you teach at DePaul. Mm-hmm. So is that what you thought you would do at some point, or is that something that you kind of slid into home base on? I
think I always thought I would at some point. I think it's happened earlier than I thought it would. But the interesting thing about it is that I found it there's a really kind of vital symbiosis between my personal work and my playwriting work and what I teach in the classroom. And it changes constantly. The questions that I'm grappling with in my own work, I'll figure out ways of crafting exercises or whole classes out of trying to deal with those questions. So it's a really interesting balance.
Do you feel it ever robs you of either time or?
Oh, well, time is always precious, but
but your creative energy or your passion, is any of that lessened because you're teaching? I'm curious.
It makes it a little harder sometimes, just because the time commitment is so huge, and I get very invested in the classroom and very invested in my students, so it does sometimes, you get tired at the end of the day, so yeah. Yeah.
So how do you convince your best playwriting students' parents that $40,000 education, or $100,000 or $150,000, wherever it happens to be, is probably a good thing for their child?
That's a really tricky question. My best playwriting students.
I'm hoping you'll give me an answer.
That's a tricky one. That's a tricky one. I think. I think the investment has less to do with actual playwriting than because I'll tell my students that a lot of you won't continue doing this, but what do you get from this particular experience that's going to shape or influence your life down the road, whatever you do? And I think that there's something about the kind of intellectual, emotional, psychological investigation that goes into writing a play that has the great potential to deepen you as a person and help you in whatever endeavor you choose. So in that regard, I think it's a different kind of literacy training when you're training people in theater. And then there's the student that comes through that's truly an exceptional playwright, and you feel like, oh, this is a person who has a really powerful voice and has a really strong point of view and can write a play, can tell a story, and then it's just about nurturing that, and hopefully, if parents are skeptical, that they see that work and they see that it has an impact on an audience, it has an impact people's lives. I mean, I think about, you know, convincing my own, well, my parents are very mellow that way. You know, my dad was basically like, you know, do what you want to do and we'll support you. But seeing them kind of over the years being more and more sold on what I do is really interesting. And so yeah.
Dark Play was, your latest play, called Dark Play, was a huge success at Humana. At least everything that I read, and everyone agrees that it was a huge success. Was that a surprise to you? Were you, those things are often surprising, or I don't mean it quite literally like that, but did you see it early on that, oh yeah, this is going to be something special, or?
It's hard. I felt really good about the play, and I felt like it sort of, and again, going back to the earlier conversation, that it sort of distilled down a lot of questions that I'd been asking over the last 5 or 6 years about the nature of storytelling, and the plays before that, and in retrospect are sort of prototypes for Dark Play, and that sort of distilled all the kind of values and ideas and thoughts that I had been playing with into a really kind of very simple, streamlined aerodynamic form. And so I was pretty confident about the play, and I remember the first reading we did, which was at UC Santa Barbara. Naomi Izuka used to run this lab there, and she would invite playwrights to come out, and so I was working with a group of students and writing the play for them in this workshop, and I kind of knew I was onto something, and just, you know, it was about crossing my fingers that other people would think the same thing. So, you know, you can never really control what other people or think about or how they feel about particular work. And we were just blessed with a really amazing cast and a really amazing director, and everybody hooked in. It was one, you know, it's the kind of alchemy of making plays. Oftentimes, you know, certain ingredients aren't right, but everything seemed to kind of come together and gel around this, and everybody really rallied because they believed in it. And I think, you know, the success of any play really depends on that. You know, the play can be great on paper, but if it doesn't get the right, I've certainly been through that where I've written something. You know, you have breakthroughs over time, and, you know, there's been previous plays that I felt were like real breakthroughs for me, but had lousy productions, and you know, that, so it's just, oftentimes it's just sheer luck that everything comes together in a really good way. But it was great. It was a really, really wonderful experience. And
was there a particular event that you read about in, say, a newspaper or you saw on television that inspired that?
It's actually loosely based on a true story that took place in Manchester, England. And I forget the exact origins of it, but I think a friend of mine, I have this friend who teaches at so what university does he teach? Anyway, he often, he doesn't know this, but he often like will tell me something that he's read that actually inspires a play. There's like 2 or 3 plays that I've written that were based on like anecdotal things that he said to me. Like, oh, that's really interesting, let's investigate that. And I think he pointed me to this story, and then it was circulating on the internet, and then there was a big article in Vanity Fair about it. So there was, you know, it was kind of out there. And I was just fascinated with the story because the previous 2 plays were dealing with, again, going back to this thing of kind of contemporary storytelling, and human interest story sort of deals with the reality genre as a kind of jumping off point, and the sort of blurring of actual pain and sort of simulated pain on television. And then the second play in that series is called Mimesophobia, which is a cinematic treatment of all the stuff that happens in human interest story, but as a separate play, and sort of deals with it in terms of movies, in terms of celebrity and that kind of thing. I was thinking, okay, the next play has to somehow deal with the internet, but how do you write an internet play and without it being kind of cheesy or sort of, but how do you kind of find a form that actually can replicate the experience of being on the internet and the sort of uncertainties that exist in chat rooms and in social networking spaces like MySpace and that kind of thing. So the story was a really interesting template for exploring that. And one of the things that was really fascinating in all the material and articles about the actual incident, the motive of the character who's duped. It's a 15-year-old kid who dupes this other kid into believing that that there's this girl who's falling in love with him on the internet. It gets very complicated, but it never became very, and ends up with a really horrific act of violence at the end of the play. And one of the things that was never really addressed in the journalistic accounts was, what was the motive of the kid who was duped? Like, why did he go so far to believe all these really, really outlandish things? What was driving him to do that? And it was a question that kind of kept me up at night, and was kind of a starting point for the play. And it became very interesting trying to figure out what that was, and at what point does he become complicit in it, and those sorts of questions. And what we found in the original workshop of it was that it's really a love story. You know, that the sense of this character longing and needing to feel love so deeply that he's willing to kind of subsume himself in this fiction, which isn't so different than a lot of relationships that take place in the real world. So that desire for something that's that gives you a sense that there's something more to life than the ordinary.
Mm-hmm. Now, I could be wrong about this, but to my knowledge, I don't think you've written a musical, and I don't believe you've worked in film and television, or have you? And I just don't realize that. I
haven't. There's in Unfinished Highwayscape, there are songs. It's by no stretch of the imagination a musical, right. But there are songs, and the melodies are based on folk songs, but they're lyrics that I wrote for them. So there's like these musical moments that that take place in the play. But I've never written like a full-blown musical. So
you're a true man of the theater, then?
Yeah, well, musical. I mean, I would love to write a musical, but in terms of the the sort of straight drama, yeah. And I'm kind of dabbling right now in screenwriting, partly because of some interest that has come out of Humana. But again, that's I feel like I'm an infant at that, because it is a entirely different form.
Thank you, Carla.
You're very welcome. Thank you.